Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. In this series of Early Childhood Ireland's podcasts, we're looking at outdoor play. In previous episodes, we've spoken about research, a survey of members that we in Early Childhood Ireland conducted with our members. We've spoken to some members of Early Childhood Ireland about how they support outdoor play and learning in their settings. And I'm delighted today to be joined by my colleague, Frances Byrne, who will talk about a recent event that Early Childhood Ireland held called Valuing Outdoor Play. Frances is the Director of Policy, Advocacy and Campaigning in Early Childhood Ireland. And you'll all know she has a huge interest in advocating for children in early years and school age care in member settings in Ireland in relation to government policy and influencing that policy to ensure quality for children. Frances, you're really welcome, and thanks for coming on the podcast today.
I'm delighted to be here, Maura.
In March of this year, we had an event called Valuing Outdoor Play to influence policy, I suppose, in relation to the value of outdoor play and why it's so significant and vital for children. So, Frances, can you take us through what that event entailed, why we hosted it, and who was there?
Yeah, so Maura, this was you've contextualized it very well. This was in our minds in Early Childhood Ireland, an event that took place in the context of us wanting to work with members and to influence the development of guidance around outdoor settings in the context of a wider review of the regulations that oversee settings. And we, as you said, had done some great work with members last year in 2022. And so we decided that at some point early in 2023, we needed to have a policy and research event. And we were delighted to have two excellent experts, one from Norway, one from Scotland. And we were delighted to be joined by officials from the Department of Children, as I still call it, and from Tusla and from the Department of Education. And in our audience, we were delighted to be joined by a range of officials and colleagues from those organizations, from stakeholder organizations, our own members, some of whom have been very prominent and I would suggest giving leadership in this important area. And we were delighted that the Children's Ombudsman joined us, and as well as some representatives of TDs and councillors. So that was great because it was very much a policy-facing event. And we wanted to hear about developments in Norway because, as per usual, as I'm always saying, the Nordic countries are very far ahead of us, and it was just so interesting to hear and be challenged by the language that was used. We then heard from the Scottish Care Inspectorate. They are a further along on the journey as well, but not as far as we are. So that was very interesting and challenging and really set up the context for the day's work to sort of realise what's possible, to be challenged. But then we moved on to one of our colleagues gave an overview of our member survey and an overview of some of the work to date. There was a gorgeous video one of our colleagues made showing some of the outdoor provision that's already available. So it was all very inspiring. And I must say, by lunchtime, it was one of those moments for me, and I said this in the summing up at the end, I ended up feeling quite proud. I think we're further along than we thought. And I think also that COVID provided Early Childhood Ireland settings around Ireland, the government, the regulator, a chance to actually see the difference that outdoors can make. So possibly, if you were looking at it in marketing terms, this is a really positive post-COVID story. And that was very clear on the day.
The last episode of the podcast that we spoke about related to our barometer, have we a sense from the barometer of what the view of the public is in relation to outdoor play?
Well, indeed. So we as you know, and we've talked about it before, commission a Red C poll every year. And we don't always publish every question and answer. And sometimes, to be frank, we're testing things ourselves to see what's the overall view here, and also what's the view of particular demographics. So we were really heartened because we put forward a statement describing what happens in Nordic countries, that most of the provision is outside unless the weather is extremely cold. And we were delighted to see that 64% of Irish adults, rising to 70% of parents with very young children, completely supported the idea of children spending most of their time in early years and school age care settings outside. And that certainly, again, it's one of those things where you wish you had a crystal ball and we could have asked it in 2019 because now that parents have seen it, because I know from previous work that Early Childhood Ireland has done, and just listening and talking to members in the general day-to-day work, the members who've been leading out on this have sometimes in the past described resistance. Now, resistance with a small r, not big resistance, but resistance and concern and questions from parents. And really what we're hearing now more and more is that there's a kind of an understanding of how good and healthy it is and safe for children of all ages and all sizes. And so it's just very heartening because sometimes what's the word I'm looking for? You can be, gauging something and then discovering, the support isn't as high as we would like, but that's fantastic. Nearly 2/3 of all adults, regardless of whether they're parents or not. So that was brilliant. Yeah. And we had deliberately sort of not put that into the public domain until the day of the conference, and people were really happy to hear it. So that was lovely as well. Yeah.
I think it's great to ask the question. It's so important because what came into my mind there when you were saying about, gauging support. I remember one time doing a training on with a group of educators and, asking what parents, wanted children to get from their time in their settings. And some people were saying, we were talking about the value of play and so on. And some people were saying, well, parents want their children to learn their letters and numbers. And one educator said, I used to think that until I actually asked the parents and discovered that what the parents wanted was for their children to be happy, to have fun, to get on with other children, to play and so on. And sometimes we might think we know the answer. Yeah. We don't always until we actually ask the question.
So true.
But you mentioned about being safe, and one of the things that we sometimes talk about, and particularly we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Norwegian story in a second, the idea of challenging play. And we've recently had very good news on the insurance front in regard to risky or challenging play, haven't we?
Yes, and actually I should have said that the insurers were in the room, which was brilliant.
That was great.
Not to speak, but to be participants in the room. And yeah, Teresa, our CEO, used the opportunity to acknowledge that, there have been really welcome developments in the area of risk management, because of course that's where sometimes our heads go, maybe not in Early Childhood Ireland, or we assume that's where other people's heads go. And it's really welcome that there's now provision for risky play and the use of real tools for the first time. And like that's really important. And look, I think, a lot of credit goes to our members, who have led the way on this and shown that this is so good at developing children's sense of achievement, and that actually, and there is evidence to back this up, that actually it's very safe. Obviously, you have to have very well educated educators and very aware educators who are guiding and leading that. But yeah, that's been really important. And I think in terms of sequencing, given that when we were gathering on the 29th of March, you know, both Tusla and the department were very clear that this was the end phase of their work, and that they were going to be coming out with outdoors guidance. And so it was really good that they knew this ahead of that. And of course, the day that we're meeting to discuss this more, the guidance has been released into the wild, if I might say. We're still going through it. It's certainly a very lovely looking document, and it has a very nice title. And you know, certainly, look, that's very that might sound very superficial, but I think that the that members and others will be very heartened by it, because it has the really gorgeous title, When the Roof is the Sky, Guidance for the Registration and Inspection of Early Year Services Operating Outdoors. So I think that's a positive signal. But as I said, we'll certainly be going through it.
We'll be coming back to it.
Yeah, and to
in
see.
Future.
Say that again.
We'll be coming back to it in future when
Yeah.
when we've had time to absorb the contents of it. That quote from Margaret Macmillan is always lovely. That concept of being roofed by the
it's really lovely
sky.
to see it. Like, I think it's an important signal. And certainly it's important to say that in the room on the day, there was a very positive atmosphere. It wasn't, you know, sometimes policy meetings can be fraught. You know, you're trying to perhaps push you know, agencies or departments to do things that they don't want to do, or they might be reluctant to do. And that wasn't the atmosphere on the day. It was very collegiate, and clearly a huge amount of reflection has been going on, both within the department and within Tusla and within both departments. And like, again, I think that possibly the timing, even though obviously nobody would want to go back to early 2020, possibly the public health guidance that was necessary during COVID possibly helped with that. So look, as I said, it was a positive day, and on the face of it, it looks like very positive guidance has been issued by Tusla today, which is great.
We mentioned risk and we mentioned Norway, and I'm lucky enough to have done a study trip to Norway 10 or 11 years ago, and the sight of, you know, 2 and 3 year olds sitting around a campfire whittling sticks with knives will stay with me, and babies sleeping outdoors. And you know, when you mention about that they only come in when the temperatures get really cold, that's like -10, not maybe 5 or 6 like we might consider here. So I know on the day we had Ellen Sandstetter speaking, and we met her at that time that we were in Norway, and she spoke about, you know, that idea of outdoor play being scary funny. Can you take us through maybe some of the things that she mentioned on the day of our event in March?
Absolutely, and I should say that Teresa, having set the context and sharing the good news both from Red Sea Poll and the update about the insurance offering, then introduced a video from the Minister Roderick O'Gorman couldn't be there, but he sent a pre-recorded video, and actually he mentioned in the video that both the department and the inspectorates had previously heard from Professor Sandstetter and indeed from Doreen Watson from the Scottish Care Inspectorate, who I'm sure will go on to discuss more. So immediately I think everyone was like, oh, this is a really good sign, that both of the kind of recognised experts who we have invited, clearly if the department and the inspectorates have been having them in, that, you know, it really set an excellent tone. So yes, Professor Sandstetter was so interesting and inspiring and challenging, and, you know, not afraid to talk about the benefits of thrilling play and risky play, talking about, you know, it should be uncertain, it should be thrilling and exciting, and include the chance of physical play. And she talked about the concept of scary funny, you know, that there's a kind of a, you know, that children should be on the cusp of the balancing edge between excitement and fear. And she also very generously shared from multi-country research reviews, you know, systematic research reviews that have shown that, you know, the positive correlations between risky play, well-being, social involvement, and physical activity. And of course, she did say, obviously a proud Norwegian, that overall their society has a very positive outlook on risky play, but she absolutely recognized that at a wider, more broadly EU level, that we all have a job to do to inform parents, politicians, and policymakers about the benefits of risky play for children. And she shared lots of research to help us to make those arguments. And as I said, not just in the Norwegian context, but more broadly than that. She also talked about educators training, and she shared some research on injuries. And, you know, there were some sharp intakes of breath because, you know, she said 98% of injuries were minor and but couldn't have been prevented. You know, there were tips and falls that children have. But then she gave, you know, statistics about more serious injuries. And even though they were very, very low numbers, you could hear the sharp intake of breath in the room. And certainly that struck people, I think, about, look, this is risk, but it can be managed. And she also spoke about the gender dimension. She said that research has found that male staff are more liberal than female staff in terms of their attitudes towards risky play, which is interesting, given the very low number of men we have working in settings in Ireland. And then she concluded by, you know, reiterating, you know, the need for all of us to spread the knowledge about risk and play with educators as well as with parents. And she also said that there is a specific law in Norway, which is so interesting, that protects children's access to risky play, and that this law is monitored and evaluated on an ongoing basis. So that was just so interesting to hear as well.
One time when I was managing a service, some of the staff in the setting went to a conference one weekend. So, you know, this is going back 25 or 6 years ago. And I remember them coming back on Monday, and I said, well, you know, how was the conference on Saturday? And their big takeaway from that event was that this doctor said that every child was entitled to stitches.
Oh,
and, you know, and that experience of, you know, kind of a break being nearly an adventure. It's scary, but it's nearly an adventure when you're a child. And that, you know, we learn to manage risk by being in risky situations, but that doesn't always mean that it's easy or comfortable for adults, but you know, it's learning to kind of take that step back. I think you know, looking at the outline that you sent me of what happened on the day, one of the things that Ellen said that struck me was about the understanding that Norwegian politicians have about the value of outdoor play. You know, I know that's something that and you in our policy and campaigning team would be very conscious of, but you know, we're trying to make inroads, aren't we, with you know, giving that understanding to our politicians of the value of outdoor play, which will help influence policy over time, but certainly, it's a slow process.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that's why the guidance that Tusla has published today is really welcome, because if the body that is charged with inspection legally is saying, look, here's guidance on this, it's a good thing, you know, it's that will certainly be very reassuring and helpful. But you're absolutely right. I mean, she was, you know, Professor Sandseter was very clear that this is culturally the norm in Norway. But she recognized that that's not always the case elsewhere. And she's very much a woman on a mission. and very much leaning into research, which is great and very convincing and certainly will help us. And I suppose now that, you know, the guidance is out and hopefully will be implemented according to plan and all of that, it'll be for us to sort of in Early Childhood Ireland to make sure there's no rolling back on it, you know, in the future, but also to for us to keep monitoring international developments and looking at learning from those countries that might be a bit ahead of us, because, you know, I think it's fair to say that any setting that tries this, they just, I mean, I've yet to meet one that hasn't become an absolute ambassador for it. All the educators and settings and then parents as well are sort of part of that. And it was so interesting to hear at the previous event in November, you know, these questions were asked. It was a member only event and it was members speaking about their experiences and some gorgeous showcasing. And, you know, I remember one member commenting, you know, because the question came up about, you know, did you have to persuade parents and all of this? And she was like, no, like members or parents are totally on board. And, you know, she had heard recently the week before that, you know, in the middle aisle of a, we won't say which one, but the middle aisle of a very famous, well-known German multinational shop, the little wetsuits were on sale, or they, you know, the way the middle aisle is famous, and all it was in the parents' WhatsApp, and they were all going down to get a second one, you know, and all of that, and the negotiations about that, you know, do the children get changed? Do they come in the wetsuits? Do they, you know, all of that is so interesting. And look, every member has told us parents are just so convinced by it and supported by it. And as you said, when you ask parents what do they want happy children. And I mean, I you know, every image is beaming children, even if they're covered head to toe in mud. So, you know, we rest our case, you know.
Probably, especially if they're covered in mud. So you mentioned about the Scottish experience. Can you take us a little bit through the kind of similarities and differences in their experience to ours?
Yeah, it was so interesting. And you know, I think there's a big affinity between Ireland and Scotland, and I really felt in the room when Doreen Watson, who's the service manager with the Early Learning and Childcare Inspection division in the Scottish Care Inspectorate, when she started speaking that gorgeous Scottish accent, and she made it so beautiful because her first image was her as a little girl, so she spoke from that perspective, you know, and she threaded her own life story and journey through the sort of what they've been doing in a big reform agenda, which has been going on now for more than 10 years in Scotland, which we have certainly looked on sometimes with envy in terms of, and I know parents have as well, in terms of, you know, what's available to parents. It's very different to what we hear about the experience in England and Wales. And they certainly seem to be very forward thinking about children. Now, look, their system is very different to ours. It's run through local authorities and so on. But at the level of the inspectorate, she was so interesting about the reform that they are that they are implementing. So she talked about that their understanding is that inspection is always an improvement activity, that they have two strands, which are daycare and childminding. And she then went into sharing their experience, which actually predates the big reforms that have come in Scotland in the last 10 years or so. And she went back as far as 2008, when there was a shift driven by providers, which is very interesting. And she said, you know, she asked the question and answered it for us, you know, why did it become a focus? And she said there were a number of reasons, but some of them were to do with a big attainment gap, education attainment gap that had been identified in 2014. Scotland has had a very, you know, a huge challenge around obesity, 14% versus an EU average of 5%. In Scotland also, they topped the list at one stage on the World Health Organization of the most screen time. And they also had very low, the evidence showed in growing up in Scotland, very low levels of physical activity, that it was impacting on mental health, and there was, inactivity indoors as well. So they very much saw as being outdoors as being active. So they, in 2016, they developed a position statement about risk, and in that made it very clear that the inspectorate supported providers to take a positive approach to risk in order to achieve the best outcomes for children. So, as she said it herself, this means moving away from a traditional deficit model that takes a risk-averse approach, which is so interesting, and that they felt that it was a more holistic risk-benefit model should be used, but that they didn't want written risk assessments to be carried out for daily play activities. So they have then built that position, and I suppose that very much positive disposition into their registration and inspection process. So it's really, really good. And, what their expectations are really clear. They want, even settings that are largely indoors, they must have access to an outdoor area. They accept and are happy to have 100% outdoor settings, but there must be access to sheltered areas for, extreme weather and so on. And they are fine with, satellite or dispersed settings. They want outdoor to, the outdoor part of those types of settings to mirror what a typical outdoor setting would look like, so that children can go in and out. And the plans they want to see are around the challenges like infection control, shelter, weather, sleep and rest, and toilets. So it's very much a, plan for the challenges, and not quite a get on with it, but they expect to see it. They want to see outdoors in every setting, or access to outdoors for those who may not have it. So it's very, very interesting. They developed a theory of change for promoting outdoor play. They then brought that into a quality framework that they developed 3 years ago, which spoke to the standards that they wanted, and Doreen maintained that really helped to provide reassurance and guidance to providers. And then they have also provided a series of resources, which she showed us, really gorgeous, encouraging resources to help providers to design spaces, to think about the environment, to think about learning and development. And then they also had a resource called Out to Play. So for those services that may not be in environments that are, the easiest to access outdoors, or don't have an outdoors included. And then another resource on promoting physical activity. So it was a really uplifting, inspiring presentation. And as I said, she just weaved her own life story through it. She told stories about her growing up, about why she decided to do the work she does. It was fabulous. Yeah, it was really lovely. And people were very taken by it. But also it was a really interesting journey for our two inspectorates and the Department of Children to hear about as well. Now they'd heard from her already, which was great to hear. But yeah, it was fantastic.
That strategy of linking people back to their own childhoods can be really effective. A member told me one time about a dad who was very upset that his child got potentially wet and cold building a snowman. And she said, did you ever build a snowman? His argument was ended when he remembered the fun and the pleasure.
Okay.
And was reminded that once the snowman was built, the children were then warm and dry again.
Absolutely.
And again, in Norway, their mantra was, there's nothing wrong with getting wet, it's staying wet is the problem. So exactly. It's, you mentioned about the pull-ups and the waders and so on. And Joe Flynn in the last episode mentioned about the appropriate clothes as well, which is a huge thing. So I think the next speaker then, Doreen's presentation sounds wonderful. It's, and it's great to see that they're the kinds of materials that inspectorates are using to encourage people in a positive way rather than, what sometimes is the experience of you don't have and you don't have. So, it's a much more supportive way to go. I think Toby Wolf from the DC DIY spoke as well.
He did, and very generously shared everything that has been done to date, some of which is in the public domain, and the department is very transparent, but it was really good to hear some of the thinking. And he also shared, some of because obviously the department in the current review of the legislation and regulations, which has been ongoing for the last few years, because of course it was put on hold during COVID. Toby shared, that the progress to date, but also some of the consultation findings. So, there was very strong support for minimum space requirements. There was a huge support for the development of minimum standards for facilities and fully outdoor services. And I think, this has really come from providers and managers of settings really wanting to understand what the parameters are, which is also linked very neatly into what Doreen had said. Like the Scottish Care Inspectorate recognised that people, they want support and guidance. They obviously want to be doing the best by children. And then, Toby did say that there were certainly within the consultation, people wanted to have clarity, which hopefully has come through in the guidance today, and certainly a first look at it suggests that has happened. And I suppose the other thing that Toby did was very much put the wider context in terms of the wider developments that have been going on in relation to professional development within the sector, capital funding, the new funding that has come online, and broader work that's going on in regulation and quality assurance. So that was really good to put that context. And again, great, a very timely update that the issues that the department and with the two inspectorates was considering at the time was, the challenge of the great diversity or as he put it, variation in service provision here in Ireland. So, we have full daycare, we have our ECHI only, we have our ECHI plus, we have our school age care, we have indoor, outdoor. So that's a challenge. Because if every creche, every setting in Ireland looked the same, then, you could produce one guide and all of that. And then, of course, there's the reality around which Doreen had spoken to as well. Not everybody has easy access to a beautiful space that you can develop, or an ugly space that you can make beautiful, or maybe you leave a bit of ugliness in it. Is there a broad agreement on the importance of outdoors? Are there still people to be educated both within the sector and outside? Does there need to be an additional category of outdoor settings? Does the country need a new set of outdoor specific regulations, or is it further guidance on how to interpret regulations? I think from what has come out today, the department has erred on the side of the latter, which is, guidance on interpreting the regulations, training and advice for educators and for inspectors, funding for equipment and information for parents, which were the issues. And of course, they're all the issues. So that was really good to hear. And then immediately after Toby, we were delighted to have Dr. Marie Gibbons and Grant Landon from Tusla, from the Early Years Inspectorate, who, again shared, lots of information on what they have been identifying as challenges, because they've obviously been centrally involved in this work. With the department and the Department of Education Inspectorate as well. So, they shared that there are, the particular regulations that they think are challenging. So all of the areas around registration, categorization, which are you, planning, electricity, water and sanitation, obviously sleep, obviously fire safety, obviously premises, and then space. So, there is no minimum space requirement for outdoor. So how do you determine numbers and all of that? So that's quite challenging if you're the inspectorate. Marie and Grant went on to then talk about as I said, the work they've been doing, and this is in a much wider context for them of reviewing the regulations and so on. And there was talking about things that they are aspects of this, considerations such as immunocompromised children, children who may have sensory and developmental needs, children with special rights, as the colleagues in Regio always refer to them. All of those issues that are of concern to them, but then also about the supports need, which settings have identified. And again, this is what Toby had identified as well. Do we want a more specific approach for outdoor provision and regulation, or do we want an interpretation, a shared understanding of what is outdoor pedagogy, and obviously a shared understanding of risk and risk benefit assessments, practical advice, and as to repeat what Toby had said, the diversity of settings. So Marie also shared, which was very generous of her, some research that they had done in Tusla last year, where they had identified 57 services, 17 were fully outside and 40 were substantially outside. And then what kinds of challenges and so on that they were facing. But I should mention that all through both presentations, both Grant and Marie, of course they were talking about challenges and no more from what they had been hearing from providers, but it was very clear that this was a challenge which Tusla wanted to solve with full, in a spirit of collaboration with providers, with educators, to really try and, in the context of recognizing how good outdoors is, and really try and reach at a shared understanding, and that, it would very much be a guidance document, and that it would be subject to regular reviews. So that's the guidance that has come out today, and they made it very clear that there would be continuing engagement with services, which is great. So very, very positive from the Tusla Inspectorate.
The DES Inspectorate, had they, what was their input relating to?
Yeah, so Dr. Marisa Dignan joined the panel and spoke, and was, really interesting about just some interesting points from the perspective of, again, totally positively disposed to and talked about the value of outdoors, but also, I suppose, from their perspective, some very interesting comments that, what happens in early years influences later cycles. So, brought the primary and secondary education sectors into the room, which of course is absolutely right. And Doreen has certainly referred to this, setting children up for life and all of that. So that was interesting. I think that it's fair to say that, and of course, Marisa referred to the curriculum, to the curriculum frameworks, and acknowledged that Ashtar and Shielta refer to many criteria relating to the outdoor environment, and spoke about the wonderful examples of good practice that currently exist. Felt very strongly that we don't need to change anything major, anything macro, is how it was put, and that actually the criteria for effective pedagogy for outdoors is the same as indoors, and that outdoor learning is autonomous and active. Children are motivated and support, are motivated intrinsically, and what matters is how they're supported by educators, which of course is true. Express the view that children have greater agency when they're outside. I think, there was a lot of nodding heads in the room for that. And, briefly spoke to what Doreen had said, for settings who don't have, easy access to an outdoor area, there are absolutely ways of doing that, bringing nature inside, excursions, access to farms, and so on. And, Marisa then spoke about her Monday morning rule, as she described it. So, what can I do tomorrow without money or new regulations? And that, she felt that the need to simplify, observe, reflect and share ongoing learnings with colleagues about outdoors in the same way as the sector would be anyway for other things. So that was very interesting, as I said, to hear from both inspectorates and to hear that it was very, very positive and very collegiate.
That's great. That's great. And I think, it's been fascinating to hear that overview of the progress of the day with the international expertise, and then, the expertise and knowledge and willingness to support these kinds of developments has been really interesting. But I think people will be able to read the proceedings of the conference shortly, isn't that right?
Yes, indeed. And there was a final kind of a panel to sum up, and we were delighted that Julia Hearn from the Children's Rights Alliance joined us, and she had been there for the day, and she was so positive. She was saying it was one of the best things, and obviously that it was a very positive day, and great to be in the room and to hear all the positivity, and that isn't always the case, and particularly around this, it was just children's rights, every box is ticked, and obviously it's more than that, but so there was a great discussion. But yes, we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the conference proceedings, and they will be on the website. And Early Childhood Ireland is also developing a position paper about outdoors, which will be available in the autumn. I better not be a hostage to fortune by saying it'll be available any earlier. We have a kind of a budget submission to get across the line before then, and lots of lobbying on that to do over the summer. But it is our intention to do that and to embed it within our policy work. And also, I suppose it's part of the organization's contribution to that very, very nice challenge that we heard from Professor Sanseter to really, play our part in bringing policymakers, politicians along that journey and convincing them. And also then, if the guidance is going to be reviewed every 6 months, that becomes our way of evaluating it, obviously in conjunction with members. So that's to come as well in the next while. But look, it's one of those we hear understandably the enormous challenges that members face. And even though there's €1 billion, which I said before on the podcast, Maura, I wouldn't have believed anyone who told me that 2023 was going to see €1 billion spent, but we've still a way to go in Ireland. There are enormous challenges, but once again, just like with the access and inclusion model, with Link, with the brilliant curriculum that we have for early years, and with other examples, the settings that are doing this and trying are really leading the way. It's a very, it's inspiring. It was inspiring to be in that room and to hear that the video, which, will, it's just really important and, to be supported and encouraged. And I suppose in the other part of our policy work, we will absolutely be monitoring capital funding. We will be making sure that there, some of that 1 billion has outdoors attached to it. It's so important. I'm hopeful that we're pushing an open door, because I think the recognition is across the board on the policymakers. But it's really positive and wonderful to see. And as I said, something coming out of a very bleak time that we look back on. We'll all be telling our grandchildren about living through the pandemic. And it's just wonderful to see our sector leading the way in developing this and championing it for young children. It's great.
Yeah, and talking to the two members that we spoke to for episodes of this series, they both commented on the positive impact that COVID had on their use, and they were already committed to it, but the funding enabled them to maximize their use and the support of parents. So it's good to see the lessons that were learned, maintaining progress. So that's really, really good. I suppose I should also say that the other thing that was presented on the day, and you alluded to it earlier, was the report on our member survey, which formed episode 1 of this series. So if you're wondering as a listener why we haven't gone back to that, pop back and listen to episode 1, where Liz Kearns, our Director of Research, it takes us through that, if you're wondering why that was left hanging. So Francis, thanks a million for your time today. It was great to hear the overview of proceedings, and keep an eye on our social media channels and weekly e-zine, and we'll let you know when the proceedings from that day have been published. And we will also be coming back to the Tusla guidelines. So thank you for listening, and thanks to Aricus for their support of the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.